102 lives lost, 151 homes destroyed, 500,000 businesses affected in disaster-declared areas, 5,000 miles of road. This is North Carolina statistics, ladies and gentlemen. 5,000 miles of road, including almost 5 miles of I-40 damaged and impassable for likely a couple of years. 1,300 public bridges and culverts damaged. 163 water and sewer systems damaged. 20,000 farms, disaster-declared counties with $3.4 billion in damage. This is a storm unlike any we've ever seen in our nation's history in the inland. 250 miles inland with nearly Category 1 hurricane force. After several days of drenching rain just a few days before. We have a disaster-declared area. If you eliminate some that were technically declared disasters, if you only count the landmass that has devastation like you've seen in Asheville or Boone or Burnsville or Big Creek or Canton or Clyde, I have thousands of people in harm's way. So I went to the floor last week just to try and fix one problem. But let me back up as I see Senator Schatz here. Back in August, Senator Schatz, I believe it was August, Senator Schatz, came to me and said, Tom, I hope you'll support me on the supplemental for Maui. I said, count me in, Brian, because I have no doubt that before the end of this season, I'll probably have to come to you and ask your support, and I'm expecting you'll be there, as he always is, as most of you already are. Actually, as 99 of you were last week to get the Small Business Administration plus up of $800 million. I had one objection. Now, folks, I don't think that my folks in North Carolina, Georgia, where both of my children were raised, and a sister who had a house damaged by the storm, or Florida, where I was born, they don't need tears, they need action. And we not only need action in the way that we normally respond to storms, we need an action in a very different way. I'm not talking about, I was born in Florida, raised in New Orleans, lived in virtually every southern state. I've seen storms in my life. I saw Camille hit Mississippi on my way to move to New Orleans. I've seen these storms. And interestingly enough, the topology of the coastal plains, you pretty much know what you need to get fixed pretty soon. And within 2 years, you can probably get most of the infrastructure done, people recovering their lives for decades, if ever. But that's not what we have in North Carolina. We have several river basins that flooded entire towns. Asheville just got drinkable water 2 days ago. The storm hit 54 days ago. And there are some communities that won't have it. I've got a community near the Virginia line that may be without power until March. The media has moved on, but the damage, it is impossible to conceive, even with what I'm saying today, without being there. And I would invite any of you to come here or come there and see it. So I'm going to submit my formal testimony for the record, Chair and Vice Chair, but we've got to do something differently. Let me give you an example of what people in Florida, my home state, are doing right now. They're being told by FEMA that Milton, they got parts of Florida got hit by Milton, parts of Florida got hit by Helene, parts of Florida got hit by Debbie. Can you imagine a municipal official right now who's being told you got to distinguish between that utility pole that was debris with Debbie and debris with Milton or debris with Helene? Now, the good news is they're not having to distinguish between telephone poles that happened between Milton and Helene, but because Debbie was a little bit outside of the window, you got to distinguish that trash if you want to get reimbursed. Is that really what we're going to tell the states and local governments? That's how we do disaster recovery? Am I really going to say that I have to get all of my needs in 6 months to be able to have FEMA recovery? There are communities we won't get to in 6 months. So I thank you all for taking on the appropriations task. I intend to put another unanimous consent request together and maybe have another discussion with the junior senator from Kentucky, but I'm going to fight for the people who were affected, not only in North Carolina, but many states that I have family, friends, and have lived in. We've got to act. We've got to look at Paycheck Protection Program. We've got to take a look at employee tax credits programs at work. We should be instructed by COVID to recognize this is a long-term recovery unlike we've ever seen. And we can either learn from it and start talking about creative ways now, or we can regret it later when some of my western cities are going to dry up. That policy is separate from your appropriations task. I thank you for the work that you're doing. I fully support the OMB request for $100 billion. But that's only the beginning. We've got to react differently to storms. This may be the first, but it won't be the last like we've seen in North Carolina, and we owe it to the American people to be ready to do better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Tillis. Thank you to both of you for being here today. We will now have our second panel of witnesses come forward and move to their testimony. And while they're coming forward, let me introduce them. We are joined today by Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, Small Business Administrator, Isabel Guzman, Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, Xochitl Torres-Small, Deputy Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Adrian Todman, and FEMA Administrator, Deanne Criswell. These agencies that are before us today are on the front line of our nation's disaster response efforts. We are very grateful for all of you for joining to share your perspective on the work and needs ahead. We will begin with testimony from each of you and then move to our senators for questions. Secretary Buttigieg, if you are ready, we will begin with you.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Chair Murray. Thank you, Vice Chair Collins, and thanks to all of the members of this committee for the opportunity to speak with you today alongside my colleagues from the Biden-Harris administration. A month ago, I was in North Carolina and Tennessee visiting some of the communities impacted by Hurricane Helene. I saw entire lanes of I-40 demolished and collapsed into the gorge below, washed out by heavy rainfall, likely exacerbated by climate change. I spoke to families, to small business owners, and community leaders about how this catastrophic storm impacted their lives and livelihoods, and about what they need in the short term and for the long haul. And I met with first responders who have been working tirelessly to help the people in these communities as they contend with the loss of homes, the loss of businesses, and the loss of life. In the weeks since, the Biden-Harris administration has continued to direct extensive, well-coordinated support to the communities devastated by these storms. We're working alongside state and local governments, nonprofit groups, and volunteer organizations in the ongoing response and recovery efforts. We've been working to combat an increasingly common and unequivocally harmful part of 21st century life, the rapid spread of falsehoods that we've come to call misinformation and disinformation across digital media, which in this case included the work of the Federal Aviation Administration, which acts to facilitate response and recovery while keeping our airspace safe. As of today, the U.S. Department of Transportation, through our Federal Highway Administration Emergency Relief, or ER, program, has delivered $187 million in funding to communities in North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia, as well as the federal land management agencies in these states to support immediate needs. These funds are being put to immediate use to get roads and bridges repaired and reopened and deal with disruptions in the meantime. Already, we've seen how these funds are facilitating recovery, helping open US 276 near Caesars Head in Greenville County, South Carolina, and continuing the ongoing work along I-26 and I-40 between North Carolina and Tennessee to restore access to those critical roadways. As valuable as that work has been, the present reality is that our department will soon lack the funding to address additional needs resulting from the recent hurricanes and other prior disasters, as well as needs from future storms or other disasters. And that's because the amount of FHWA emergency relief funding being requested from numerous states far exceeds the amount of money that's available. Helene recovery alone will require extensive ongoing investment to permanently rebuild the roads and bridges destroyed by the storm. Meanwhile, we continue to have unmet need for recovery in states like Alaska, Hawaii, Maryland, and Nevada that qualify for FHWA funding to rebuild transportation infrastructure after other recent disasters. With each passing day, we are growing closer to a situation where this department will not be able to provide even partial funding for eligible projects. Consider communities in Arkansas, California, and Oklahoma that have been impacted by floods, tornadoes, and wildfires, or the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Maryland, or the Teton Pass in Wyoming. We currently lack the funds to permanently rebuild the infrastructure in these communities and many others across the country, even though they are eligible. President Biden's requested approximately $8.1 million for the ER program. These funds would cover the backlog of projects waiting for funding, as well as the needs of states from Hurricanes Helene and Milton. I also want to note that in addition to funding for that Federal Highway Administration program, President Biden has also requested $57 million for the Federal Transit Administration's Public Transportation Emergency Relief Program to assist transit agencies that were impacted by and supported local response efforts during Helene, Milton, and other disasters. There is an urgent need today for Congress to act to provide supplemental funding to support communities across this country grappling with disasters. This would not be the first time Congress has risen to the occasion. We saw it after Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma in 2005, more recently in 2018 following Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. Now the American people, including the communities in North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Florida, and Georgia, are counting on Congress to act. As we gather today, we know that investing in resilient infrastructure up front can save lives and reduce the cost of rebuilding. That's why USDOT prioritizes resilient infrastructure in its discretionary grant programs. And through the PROTECT program created through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're deploying the first ever formula and discretionary funds dedicated to making our infrastructure more resilient. We are seeing the reality of climate change in real time. Weather events that were previously deemed once in a century are coming along every few years. It is not a fluke, it is not a coincidence, and most importantly, it is not going to go away. We need adequate and sustained funding to make sure our communities have what they need to rebuild roads and bridges, to make them more resilient in the face of extreme weather and other disasters, and to help people return to normal life as quickly as possible. With your partnership, I know we can deliver the critical support that's needed right now for our transportation infrastructure, for farmers and ranchers dealing with crop loss, and for families and small business owners who need to rebuild their homes and schools and storefronts and lives. Thank you for welcoming me here today, and I look forward to working alongside you as we help these communities recover and build back stronger and more resilient for the future.
Thank you very much. Administrator Guzman.
Thank you so much, Chair Murray, Vice Chair Collins, and the distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to appear today to discuss the SBA's disaster loan program and the pressing need for additional funding. For decades, SBA disaster loans have been a proven and important resource to help communities impacted by disaster recover and rebuild. SBA offers direct loans to homeowners, renters, businesses, and private nonprofits to help communities get back on their feet. These affordable loans cover disaster losses not fully covered by insurance or other sources and provide much-needed flexibility with low-interest long terms and 1 year of deferred payments and no interest accrual. Harvard University research shows that early access to disaster funding makes a difference in communities receiving more, and those communities receiving more SBA funding are more likely to experience sustained growth versus lagging. In coordination with FEMA, other federal agencies, and state and local entities, SBA helps small businesses prepare for, respond to, recover from, and mitigate against disaster. In fiscal 24 alone, SBA approved over 27,000 disaster loans totaling $1.7 billion and 160 disaster declarations across the 53 states and territories. Behind each loan is a story of a resilient American seeking to rebuild and recover. In Asheville, North Carolina, I met with Biltmore Village restaurant owners whose businesses remained closed while they repaired physical damage after devastating flooding from Hurricane Helene. In Tampa, Florida, I met with the owners of a popular local restaurant who weathered Hurricane Milton but lost power and inventory and were closed for several days. Everywhere I met homeowners, dismayed to find out they lacked the coverage for floods and seeking to rebuild, clean up, and stay in their communities. SBA has a vital role to play in the federal disaster response, but the agency's disaster loan program has been unable to meet demand since October 15th, after a surge in demand for disaster loans following Helene and Milton led SBA to exhaust all available subsidy funding for disaster lending. Hours after the president issued disaster declarations for Helene and Milton, SBA staff were on the ground ready to help survivors. SBA has been working around the clock to provide up-to-date, timely information to constituents and minimize the confusion and delays. SBA has also continued to process these loan applications, provide the customer service support, and communicate directly with survivors while we wait for Congress to appropriate the funding to originate new loans and disperse those funds to the more than 12,500 disaster victims who are already in the queue. SBA is currently supporting more than 400 total disaster declarations across the nation and managing a portfolio of 2.5 million loans valued at $285 billion. We have over 3,500 employees that have been deployed supporting loan operations and field operations. And on the ground, we've deployed hundreds of staff across 18 different states to operate more than 175 disaster centers for face-to-face support. However, a lack of SBA disaster funding has impacted recovery across the nation. SBA helps those uninsured or underinsured disaster survivors, as I said, who cannot access credit elsewhere. Homeowners, renters, and businesses are either delaying action or resorting to higher costs of capital. This means there are challenges and delays in rebuilding neighborhoods and reopening small businesses. Homeowners have been unable to access low interest rate loans to remove debris or eradicate mold so they can return to their homes. Survivors who lost a car cannot purchase a new one to take their children to school or get themselves to work. Small businesses cannot replace damaged equipment or inventory or cover economic injury from business disruption. Our disaster-impacted communities need access to SBA loans, and we hope Congress will work quickly to restore funding for this important program. SBA strongly supports the administration's supplemental budget request for SBA's $2.249 billion in funding for SBA's disaster loan program. The administration's request updates the SBA's disaster loan request the administration has been making since the Maui wildfires in 2023. The new $2.249 billion includes vital funding to support disaster lending, as well as the administrative funds the agency needs to process these loans, review for fraud, service, collect, and support disaster survivors on the ground. This funding will allow SBA to immediately begin making approximately $900 million in loan offers to those more than 12,500 approved borrowers waiting in the queue since funds were exhausted. SBA will also continue to process the nearly 48,000 pending loan applications and continue to support new applicants as they continue to come in the door. SBA expects that lending for Hurricanes Helene and Milton will reach significant disaster levels given the widespread damage across multiple states, including in areas not identified as flood zones where lack of insurance was widespread. We have worked closely with the House and Senate Appropriations Committees to provide timely updates about the disaster lending account ever since our 23 supplemental request, in addition to publishing the statutorily required monthly reports. But a series of megastorms such as Helene and Milton show how quickly disaster balances can change. Americans do not know where the next disaster will occur, but helping our fellow citizens recover from disaster is a responsibility we all share. SBA looks forward to working with you to secure those resources necessary to fortify SBA's critical disaster lending program into the future. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Deputy Secretary Torres Small.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair Murray. Thank you, Vice Chair Collins. And thank you, esteemed members of the Appropriations Committee, for convening this crucial discussion on how we show up for American people in the wake of disaster. I ask that you refer to my written testimony for a more complete account of the devastation that farmers, workers, and rural communities have experienced in recent months, and the work USDA has done so far to help them recover. Every time I visit a disaster site, I'm struck by how close we all are to experiencing homelessness, going bankrupt, or relying on a food bank for nourishment. Disasters hit everyone in their path, and no one deserves the punishment of a storm or a fire. Those impacts might include losing your home, losing your business, and if you're a farmer, losing the chance to pass your farm on for future generations. And that's why people work together in the government across political lines, agencies and levels to clear trees, to deliver water and food, and to rebuild roads. We all agree that disaster recovery is an essential role of the government. I think we can also all agree that government can be cumbersome. There are kinks in the system, and I want to talk about those kinks because they slow down the resources that individual families and whole communities need so desperately. Timeliness, flexibility, and fairness must be the North Stars of disaster assistance. For USDA, that comes down to doing all we can to keep farmers farming and support people in rural communities as they rebuild. So I hope we can spend some time talking about operations, how we get resources out the door most quickly and delivered to those who most need them. Recognizing that the smallest operators in our food supply chain are essential to that chain and are also often the most at risk of going out of business after a disaster. When government delivers resources in a way that is both timely and fair, we're able to be there for families, for businesses, and communities in their time of need. We're able to build an economic bridge for farmers and producers so they can continue to feed us all. Whenever I think about the storms of 2024, I think about a family-owned and operated pecan farm that I visited in South Carolina this October. Hurricane Helene had destroyed about 75% of this farmer's crop, and about half of his trees will never produce again. His sons had just invested in a processing facility to support their harvest and the harvests of their neighbors. The facility was going to cut transportation costs and add value to the whole community of farmers. But now, there's not enough nuts to process. What struck me most about their story is that while they were waiting out the storm and worrying about the impact on their own future, the farmers' sons put on their rain jackets and went into the storm because they were also members of the volunteer fire department. They were first responders. They were making sure before anything else that their neighbors didn't lose their lives. That's how crucial community is to disaster response. And USDA wants to be part of that community. USDA is part of those communities. And disaster recovery and assistance work is work that we are deeply honored to do. In agriculture, you can't plan for every possible impact. So getting money quickly out to those pecan farmers and to growers and to producers like them is our solemn responsibility. Let's work on that together. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Deputy Secretary Todman.
Good morning, Chairperson Murray, Vice Chair Collins, and members of this august group. It's important for HUD to be here at the table because without the $12 billion that we have requested through the president, simply said, the homes of thousands upon thousands of Americans will never be rebuilt. And their communities will have a housing shortage, the like that they've never seen before. Since I joined the department in 2021, I've traveled to communities after a disaster to talk with people and to gauge the work ahead. In Asheville, in the wake of Hurricane Helene, I met with local leaders, hurricane survivors, small business owners, to learn about what they needed. Similarly, I went to Lee County, Florida, after Hurricane Ian and saw the damage there and heard from the people. I visited Maui after the wildfires, Mayfield, Kentucky, after the tornadoes. And time again, I heard the same thing, how much they needed their national partners to help them recover. And I'm confident that through the concerted, unified federal efforts, we will mitigate damage done to communities and rebuild with resiliency. With Congress's support, HUD has provided disaster recovery funds to not only drive the long-term recovery of communities, but also to make sure that those communities are better prepared for when the next disaster strikes. We do this by ensuring that the rebuilding standards address the hazards that these communities are likely to face in the future. and by providing necessary funds to these communities to make their future safer as well. These funds can be spent making homes and other buildings like hospitals and schools stronger, and implement community-wide mitigation projects, and engaging the people in building out what those plans need to be. For instance, in Lockport, Louisiana, $7 million of disaster recovery funds were used to build a new apartment building that could withstand very high winds, and that building was 90% complete when Hurricane Ida hit in August of 21. It was practically unscathed by the storm and was soon completed and was the only rental units available for some time after that event. In Lincoln City, Oregon, HUD Disaster Recovery Fund supported the construction of a 44-unit apartment complex that housed wildfire survivors. In Moore, Oklahoma, after a tornado devastated the Royal Park Mobile Home Community, disaster recovery funds were used to build back 220 homes to help not just folks who were survivors of the tornado, but other community members as well. That is the work that these funds do. And it's so important for this Congress to act with urgency. We must do better. We have a moral obligation to protect people. It takes 4 years today, it takes 4 years from the point of an event for there to be housing substantially built after a disaster. That is far, far too long. That's why, in addition to having the $12 billion available to HUD to help people rebuild, we also need our disaster recovery program to be codified and authorized so that it's there for Americans over and over again, so that we can plan shortly after an event, that local leaders and state leaders can plan as they're in response mode what those long-term recovery needs must be. You know, I feel it was just yesterday, senators, that I had to, on behalf of my family, pull together a care package of batteries, clothing, toiletries, because their home had been severely damaged. It would have been great to share with them that there was a program there ready to make sure that their home could be rebuilt and their neighbor's home as well. When I was in Asheville not too long ago, I met a Mr. Wilson who had a business. And he came up to me, he was a little nervous. I had a little piece of paper in his pocket, he'd opened it up, and I don't know how he did the research, but he did. And Mr. Wilson said, you know, Ms. Todman, we need help. I need your disaster recovery funds, not just for my family and my home, but for my business and to bring my employees back. So let me say, Mr. Wilson, if you're watching this one day, I am here for you. We are here for you and for every other person who's been impacted by these disasters, so you can help rebuild your communities. Thank you, Senators. That concludes my testimony.
Thank you. Administrator Criswell.
Thank you and good morning, Chairman Murray, Vice Chair Collins, and esteemed members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding FEMA's supplemental funding request and the Disaster Relief Fund. I'd like to begin by expressing my deepest gratitude to the dedicated leaders joining me at this table and to the broader network of government agencies, the private sector, nonprofits, and others who partner with FEMA every day. Together, we work tirelessly to protect and assist Americans during disasters. Emergency management is built on this collaboration, and it's their partnership that is essential to the daily efforts of FEMA's workforce. Before continuing, I would like to address the recent issue about the FEMA employee who had given instructions to her disaster survivor assistance team that were completely at odds with FEMA's mission. When my senior leadership team informed me of the situation and provided me with the visual evidence that this employee had issued instructions for her team to avoid homes with a specific political affiliation, my leadership leadership team recommended and I directed that we immediately terminate this employee, and we did. In the statement I released the same day of this employee's termination, I repeated to all FEMA employees and the American people that this type of behavior and action will not be tolerated at FEMA. We hold all employees accountable if they violate our standards of conduct. When a disaster strikes, it is collaboration that enables us to respond swiftly and effectively. This spirit of partnership has been especially crucial during the responses to Hurricanes Helene and Milton, where FEMA has mobilized over 10,000 personnel and collaborated with more than 30 federal agencies to ensure critical services and life-sustaining resources reached the hardest-hit communities. For example, through collaboration with our partners, FEMA mobilized 24 urban search and rescue teams that included 1,500 personnel, 110 canines, and 90 swiftwater rescue resources to conduct rescue efforts. We also pre-positioned 9 million meals, 10 million liters of water, over 300 generators, and worked closely with the Department of Health and Human Services to deploy medical capabilities, including healthcare site assessment teams and health and medical task forces. These efforts represent the true spirit of FEMA's mission to serve and protect every community. However, we now face significant challenges due to increased disaster demands. FEMA did receive $20.2 billion in the continuing resolution, yet the DRF has been depleted to less than $5 billion as of today, due to the rising operational needs. This shortfall underscores an urgent reality. The DRF needs sufficient funding to handle the scale and intensity of today's disasters, particularly as we face the aftermath of not only Hurricanes Helene and Milton, but also the Maui wildfires and other emergencies. We have over 100 open major disasters and millions of citizens relying on FEMA's support, and our work remains vital to communities in the ongoing recovery process. The surge in demand following recent hurricanes has been unprecedented. In just 1 month, we saw over 2.4 million households register for assistance, breaking records set during previous catastrophic storms. FEMA has already provided more than $7.8 billion in federal assistance for Hurricanes Helene and Milton. And this amount includes $3 billion for individual assistance and $1.7 billion for public assistance. But these needs have rapidly exhausted our available funds, and without a supplemental, our ability to respond to new disasters could be jeopardized. Earlier this year, FEMA recognized we would need to take steps to manage the limited resources by implementing Immediate Needs Funding, or INF. This process allowed us to focus on preserving necessary funding for essential, life-saving, and life-sustaining activities, but required us to pause over $8.8 billion in funding for critical recovery projects across the country. This pause impacted communities across the country, delaying repairs to vital infrastructure and leaving long-lasting effects on communities' capabilities to build back better and stronger. And as the balance of the DRF decreases, we are again assessing whether or not we need to reinitiate immediate needs funding. Our resource needs, however, extend beyond the DRF. Programs like the National Flood Insurance Program are under tremendous strain, with nearly 74,000 claims filed following Hurricanes Helene and Milton, amounting to $843 million. I joined the President and urged legislative action to stabilize the NFIP. FEMA faces increased debt and rising interest costs, which threaten the fund's long-term viability. It is very clear that the stakes are high. As our communities face more frequent and devastating disasters, they increasingly rely on FEMA and our federal partners. This is why I strongly encourage Congress to fund all agency requests, as they all support FEMA's work of helping communities recover. For instance, cuts to housing and urban development's housing assistance programs can leave survivors without access to housing and increasing sheltering costs, while reducing funding for Small Business Administration disaster loans limits our business's ability to rebuild. Such shortfalls not only strain FEMA by increasing its workload, but also create coordination challenges among federal agencies, resulting in gaps and inefficiencies in disaster response. Additionally, limited funding for mitigation efforts reduces long-term resilience in affected areas, leaving them more vulnerable to future disasters and intensifying FEMA's burden in subsequent events. The administration's supplemental request is about ensuring that FEMA, along with our federal partners, can meet the demands and provide the assistance needed. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. We will now begin a round of 5-minute questions for our witnesses, and I ask all of our colleagues to please keep track of the clock and try and stay within those 5 minutes. Let me begin. We have heard from all of you, your testimony, as well as our colleagues, on how bad the conditions are on the ground. I want to start by asking about impacts if Congress were to continue to delay in providing this disaster funding. And Secretary Buttigieg, I want to start with you. DOT has provided $187 million in quick release for states hit by Hurricane Helene to address some of the urgent repairs and ensure the safety of the traveling public. That was a critical, immediate step, and it's left now. I understand the department has less than $120 million remaining for that emergency relief program. If we fail to act quickly, what happens if another hurricane or winter storm hits?
Well, in short, we would be unable to say yes, either in full or in part, to those quick release requests. We work to turn those around in a matter of hours when possible, and we have been able to say yes to 100% to those quick release requests. I'll also note that that figure, $119.6 million, is not just quick release, but the program balance. So in addition to those very quick answers, twice a year, we do the allocations for the overall fund, whether that's for recent disasters or ones going back a few years where a community is still in recovery. Those too would be impacted because it's all the same funding. And so very quickly, we would be simply unable to support any of these disasters.
Thank you. And Administrator Guzman, in 2024 and 2025, SBA received over 280,000 applications from disaster survivors. That number, I understand, is expected to increase in the coming weeks. And meanwhile, the SBA Disaster Loan Program has been unable to originate new loans for more than 35 days, and 60,000 renters, homeowners, and businesses remain stuck in the backlog now. Talk to us about the impact of this lapse on disaster survivors and explain why we need to provide that funding now.
SBA provides that support for those who don't have insurance or are underinsured. In addition, these are people who do not have credit elsewhere. And so these constituents are faced with higher costs of capital or no capital access at all to be able to rebuild their lives. And so with delays, this further impacts them. As I said, I have nearly $1 billion sitting there waiting to deploy as soon as I get funding, plus the additional 48,000 applications that we are still processing. $30 million a day is what we approve. So the longer this sustains, the further these constituents will not be able to access the program. And I would say that for the businesses, it's not just the businesses, it's the homeowners, the renters. 70% of our funding goes to homeowners and renters to get back in their neighborhoods.
Right. And if once we do replenish this account, how long will it take for that money to hit bank accounts once we act?
We would switch back our systems from the technology perspective and hope to get those awards within 24 to 48 hours. However, these are loans. We would need to continue through the process and finalize those loans to disperse dollars within as fast as 24 hours to up to 2 to 4 weeks.
Okay, thank you very much. Administrator Criswell, the Disaster Relief Fund, as we all know, plays a really major role in helping our communities respond to these disasters. We provided access to over $20 billion in the DERF during the CR period, and the administration's latest request includes another $40 billion. Can you explain how the disaster programs of other agencies impact overall response and recovery efforts, and how these potential funding shortfalls for other disaster programs actually affect FEMA's work?
These disaster programs really work as a holistic way to help communities recover from disasters. While our programs support specific areas like in individual assistance, we can give homeowners that are underinsured or uninsured some funding. Our programs are not designed to replace insurance or make them whole, and that's where these other programs from USDA and SBA, CDBG-DR really come into play to have a holistic approach to community recovery. And without the supplemental disaster funding for all of these agencies, it will slow down recovery in these communities and really making it more difficult for the individuals, homeowners or renters, small businesses, and the community in general to be able to move along quickly in their recovery process.
Thank you. And let me just address this spread of misinformation and disinformation. Just quickly, what is the real-world harm if we see this misinformation, disinformation on communities?
You know, one of the things that we have to do is make sure people have faith in their government and that they know that the programs that they're providing them are going to be there to help them. And when we spread information that is inaccurate about what we are going to do or how we administer our programs, it creates fear, and people don't want to apply for assistance. And these are people that have lost everything, and we need them to be able to have confidence that when they apply for assistance, they're going to get what they need, what they deserve, and what they're eligible for.
Well, thank you. And I know in the past we've seen administrations attempt to withhold disaster funding from states and communities that were affected by some of these devastating disasters. I do think I speak for every member of this committee when I say the spread of disinformation and any efforts by anyone to withhold funds Congress has appropriated for the purpose of assisting communities in their time of need will not be tolerated, whether it comes in the form of a frontline worker or the highest levels of government. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Todman, the funds that HUD provides, the CDBG disaster funds, are awarded to states, to entitlement communities, and to tribes. However, if you look at disasters, they rarely align with those categories. And that raises a lot of concerns for smaller communities who are not going to have control over the funding. Usually it's going to go through the state, for example. How does HUD's administration of the CDBG-DR funds take into account the challenges of these smaller communities and prevent them from encountering delays as they wait for the state to funnel the money to them?
Thank you, Senator. You know, we recognize that that was an issue during this administration, and it's one of the reasons why, in addition to giving funding to states, we also look to give funding to some of our grantees, our pre-existing grantees at the local level. I think one of the things that we're challenged with is for some of those really small communities, they've never done business with HUD before. They've never had to deal with my department. So we want to make sure that they're able to execute and have the capacity. That being said, we do rely on our state partners to do the right thing and get that funding to where it needs to be. So I do look forward to working with you and this committee and your team on better ways that we can execute on that.
Thank you. Secretary Buttigieg, the administration's request includes more than $8 billion for disaster assistance through your department. The vast majority, as you've explained, would be used to help clear the growing backlog of unmet needs within the Federal Highway Administration's Emergency Relief Program. And that backlog includes costs incurred such as $100 million for typhoon damage in Alaska to more than $10 million for 4 severe storm and flooding events in my state. And $7 million of Maine's unmet need is from damage that occurred over a span of just a few weeks in December of 2023 and January of this year. The December storm left 400,000 Mainers without power. This is in a state of only 1.3 million people, and it essentially left the western town of Farmington completely flooded and isolated for a time. Could you give us a better sense of how the $8 billion was calculated? I know you looked at the backlog, but is there also funding for current, more recent storms and upcoming inevitable storms?
So the figure was calculated based on the known backlog. In other words, if we only contemplated those costs that we estimate are already eligible, the $8.1 billion would cover all of that. It does not speak to future disasters, which in principle would be covered through the regular appropriations into this account. Although I would note that level is set at $100 million, and it is not unusual for the account to disperse more than $1 billion in a single year, which is why we've often come to Congress for more funding. In terms of the breakdown, $4.4 billion is for cost estimates for Hurricanes Helene and Milton. Another $1.69 billion is for the Francis Scott Key Bridge replacement. I should note that is net of $350 million, which was removed from that figure because that's going to be recovered via insurance. And any other recoveries that could happen would also reimburse the program and reduce the total. And then the rest is the emergency relief backlog, $2.3 billion, covering disasters in dozens of states, including several in Maine, as you just mentioned.
Thank you. I'm very glad that you clarified the Francis Scott Key Bridge. We had discussed that on the telephone, that this is not 100% federal. It will be net of the insurance recoveries, and I think that's a really important fact. I have many other questions for SBA on how SBA can do a better job in supporting our unique small businesses along the coast, like our lobstermen and our working waterfronts. I'll submit those for the record. Thank you.
Senator Tester.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for not only this hearing, but for your great leadership as your terms as chairman and ranking member of this committee. I have a pressing issue to discuss, but I first want to say a few things about the last 16 years that I have served on this committee. I was recently reminded of a story about a 2013 omnibus. During those negotiations, Congress decided to add a provision to that omnibus bill that would allow Monsanto to continue selling GMO products, even though a federal court had ruled that they no longer could do so. Folks referred to this as the Monsanto Protection Act. I was mad, I was upset, and I voted against that omnibus in 2013 to show everybody how upset I was, even though I was an appropriator. After all, we all know, if you're a policymaker, the easiest vote to make is a no vote on a bill that you know is going to pass. The appropriation chair, who is a very strong woman, came up to me at the time and on the floor, in fact, in the cloakroom, and said, I don't think you really want to be an appropriator. And I said, why is that? And she said, because you don't support the committee. We do the hard work. We do what we need to do. We negotiate, and you vote against it. I said, well, I do want to remain on the committee. The answer was yes then, and the answer is yes now. Why? Because there is not a better committee in this body when it comes to solving real problems, providing the oversight that's necessary of our federal agencies, and responsibly allocating resources. This committee has always been the best place to have genuine policy debates on virtually any issue. Some of my favorites over the years, and Senator Moran isn't here right now, was the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility, keeping white potatoes on the WIC list, dealing with the wild horse population, fighting back against unnecessary trucking regulations, and discussing the future of our sugar program. I could go on. Hell, even one time we moved a USD agency to West Virginia. But looking back, I do not regret that vote back in 2013 because I have feelings about what GMOs do to family farm agriculture and to the consumer. And besides that, the provision was unconstitutional. But I did learn a valuable lesson about the beauty of the appropriations process. You get some wins, you get some losses. But when this committee is doing its job, you can count on real debates on real issues that are important to Americans. And once you've won a few arguments and once you've lost a few arguments, you should vote for these bills in this committee and when you get on the floor. Because this country is better off when Democrats and Republicans in Congress, and particularly on this committee, can compromise and do their work and set a bipartisan example for the rest of the Senate. I think that is more important in this point in time than it has ever been in this country's history, where division is the biggest problem we have in this country, division among us, when we all know we have much more in common than we have what divides us. So I want to root this committee on into the future. You have a lot of really, really important work to do. The folks sitting around this rostrum can do good work. I've seen it before, and I encourage you to do that. Now I want to speak briefly on a pressing disaster issue in my state and two items Congress must include in the disaster package. The first is the Fort Belknap Indian Water Rights Settlement Act, and I want to explain why. And the second is an appropriations to continue repairs on the St. Mary's Canal. Right before the August recess, I spoke to this committee about a catastrophic siphon failure on the St. Mary's Canal, which is a vital part of the Bureau of Reclamation's Milk River project. This catastrophic failure is devastating to the small towns that rely on clean drinking water and hundreds of farmers and ranchers who rely on that project for irrigation. Sadly, this failure is not a surprise. The federal government constructed the Milk River project well over 100 years ago. It is an engineering marvel. And despite solid efforts of local residents to keep up with repairs, the system, which spans hundreds of miles, fell into disrepair. In fact, the siphons literally were held together with duct tape and baling wire. And that's why there is no question that Congress needs to step up and address this disaster and make the necessary improvements to this system to ensure that the next failure just isn't around the corner. The good news is I've got legislation that can accomplish this. It's ready to go, the Fort Belknap Indian Community Water Rights Settlement Act of 2024. Years ago, Fort Belknap Indian Community recognized that the Milk River project was a ticking time bomb that threatened access to clean water across the northern tier of Montana for both Indians and non-Indians. With this in mind, and through their strong leadership, they decided as part of the settlement of their waterment claims with the United States, they would contribute significant funds to the settlement to rebuilding the St. Mary's Canal. As a result, a bipartisan bill has already been passed by the Senate twice, this Congress. That's right, twice. The federal legislation is over 2 decades in the making. In fact, I think it's been vetted more than any other bill that I've worked on in the 18 years I've served in the Senate. It is the right bill for this moment, and it's the right time to get it signed into law with an appropriations that continue repairs on the St. Mary's Canal. I don't have any questions today to the witnesses, but I asked that as the disaster package is finalized, that folks in this committee help address our irrigation disaster in Montana. With that, tally ho, friends, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Hyde-Smith. Thank you, Senator Tester. You will be missed. Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Chair Murray and Vice Chair Collins, and I certainly want to thank everybody on the panel that has come today. And I certainly look forward to discussions on many of these issues with Chairman Schatz, as we've worked very well together. But today, however, I would like to focus on the looming farm crisis in this country. And I'm going to just start with the bottom line up, because we do not have a farm bill. It is absolutely essential that Congress provide emergency assistance for agriculture producers before the end of this year. Even if we passed a farm bill today, under the traditional farm bill structure, assistance would not reach the farmers in time. And the assistance needs to be robust, and it needs to be implemented swiftly. And then the third thing is we must address all types of disasters. And when I say that, I'm referring to natural disasters as well as market-related disasters. I'm the former Ag Commissioner of my state. I'm the former chairman of the Senate Ag Committee in my state and serve on Ag now. I've never had lenders and farm credit lenders and bankers to look at me and say, we are not going to be able to finance these farmers. I've never had that happen until now. Senators Ossoff and Tillis, they did a great job explaining the hardships facing farmers due to natural disasters. But we also need to focus on market disasters as well, which doesn't seem to be getting the proper attention. The devastation of Hurricane Helene is clear, and my heart goes out to those farmers. I've been to North Carolina. I've talked to those people. It is devastating. It's more difficult, however, to discern market-related challenges facing our farm country right now, and I'm talking about a very real crisis rooted in high input costs, rising interest rates, and low commodity prices. The USDA's recent 2024 cost of production reports best illustrates this market disaster. Here's an example of what farm data from the report. It cost an average of $895 to produce 1 acre of cotton in 2024. However, the average revenue generating from that same acre is $569. That is a $326 per acre shortfall loss between expenses and revenues. And we all know that revenues must exceed expenses to make a profit. Losses like this can add up so quickly. If a farmer planted 3,000 acres of cotton this year, that would result in a total net loss income loss of almost $1 million. $978,000 is what that farmer would lose. Obviously, nobody can exist under this. You just can't recover from that. These types of scenario were playing out across the country for all major row crops. These high input and depressed prices are hurting everyone. I mean, we're talking potato farmers, apple farmers, dairy farmers, catfish farmers, you name it. But this year, producers in Mississippi and across the country are reporting some of the best yields ever. That's what's so hard about this. And they did everything right. Yet they will go out of business if they're able to unsecure financing to farm next year. The high costs, the high interest rates, and the low prices is definitely the perfect storm. You may be hard-pressed to find a lender able to finance a farmer who is that deep in the hole, and we understand that. Just like the weather-related disasters, adverse market conditions are completely out of the farmer's control. Examples of the market loss assistance from the past, the ad hoc assistance for farmers is often misconstrued as Congress just responding to damages caused by natural disasters. While natural disasters are a common justification for ad hoc assistance, Congress also approved market loss assistance because of damaging economic effects. We most recently provided economic assistance to farmers in the CARES Act to offset economic disruptions caused by COVID-19. And there are many more examples of Congress doing so during times when crop prices were low. They do not have a safety net. We do not have a farm bill. The Omnibus Appropriations Act of '99 provided more than $3 billion in market loss payments to farmers due to low commodity prices. The FY 2000 Ag Appropriation Bill provided $5.5 billion to compensate growers for the low market prices. The Agriculture Risk Protection Act of 2000 provided money also. So today, the American farmers and ranchers are experiencing literally unprecedented market conditions. So my question, as I'm running out of time here, is to USDA Secretary Troll Small, which I so much appreciate the work you've done. Ms. Secretary, I was pleased that OMB requested the $24 billion, but should Congress provide supplemental funding for market losses, will you work to ensure the department implements those funds in a swift and effective measure?
Senator Hyde-Smith, thank you for your question. And whatever Congress establishes, it is our responsibility to deliver. Also recognize that I've spoken with farmers as well who are struggling, particularly when it comes to input costs. As Congress identifies, makes the hard choices about disaster funding as well as other economic assistance in the wake of fiscal conservatism, we know that we've got to look deep into which farmers are struggling. And so that same report you referenced does also acknowledge that in the last 4 years, total average net farm income has been up, above the 20-year average, including one banner year, and the rest of the years all above 2014, or all as high as they'd been since 2014. So that means we've really got to dive into those details about who are the farmers who are struggling and how do we support them, both this time and tracking a future where we're taking on challenges like domestic fertilization production and increased market opportunities.
Yeah, with the high cost and the interest rates, I mean, we're expecting to lose 20% of good producers. So I do think this is a true emergency and a crisis for our farmers. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chair Murray. Thank you, Ranking Member Collins, and to each of the administration officials who've testified today. Thank you for your heart, your time, your effort. We heard from each of you the stories of individuals you've connected with and where you've gone and visited, and from the folks in your agencies who are doing the very hard work of helping the people, of course, of Georgia and North Carolina, but so many other states across our country recover from disasters. This is one thing that really should bring all of us together, and I'm grateful for the work of this committee and of your agencies. I have two things I wanted to mention. Senator Tillis, in a compelling opening statement, said we have to deliver aid differently in response to disasters. Senator Murkowski and I have a bipartisan bill that's both bipartisan and bicameral, has a wide number of co-sponsors that would compel a federal resiliency strategy. More than a dozen states around the country, my home state of Delaware, her home state of Alaska, as well as the states of North Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Michigan, have state resiliency officers or state resiliency commissions. And Administrator FEMA says that every dollar we invest in resiliency before disaster strikes saves $6 in post-disaster recovery. Could you just briefly speak to whether it is worth our having a national resiliency strategy, a chief resiliency officer, and what our country might gain in terms of reducing the damage of disasters as the frequency and intensity of them seems to continue to steadily rise?
Senator Coons, we have seen an increase in the number of severe weather events, but not just the number, the complexity and the impacts that they're costing, and it's making the recovery harder. But I have also seen, as I have traveled across the United States, where we have invested in resiliency and we have seen minimal damage, proof that